What is up, my YouTube family? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, then it's just welcome to my channel, and now welcome back. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button because you will not be disappointed unless, of course, your taste level is just not refined. And if that's the case, chill, I don't know what to tell you. Every week I try to think of like some little piece of advice to give you, but the truth is I can't relate, so I don't know where to tell you to go from here. You guys, today's video might be hella long, okay? I don't know how long this video is about to be. I feel like while I was researching, it was like never ending chaos. I really thought I was about to have to do like part 1, part 2, and I literally, like, I hate that. Like, we came this close to being like 2 parts, but I feel like I've gotten it to a manageable yet lengthy 1-part video. And so what I'm not gonna do is waste a whole lot of time in the beginning running my mouth, even though I want to. But while my children are quiet in the background, I'm gonna go ahead and get this story off my chest, okay? Now, let me let y'all know right off the bat that this is going to be a ride, okay? There are several people involved in today's case, and their lives seemingly don't like commingle, but they definitely do. So bear with me, okay? Just stay with me. I promise you, it's all gonna come together. Now, first we're gonna start off in 2001 with Mike and Mary Beth Emert, who are married and successful real estate partners. The two of them live in Redmond, Washington, and from the outside appear to have as close to a perfect life as you could get. In January of 2001, Mike, the husband, is contacted directly by a client, Steven, that tells him he has an interest in viewing a property that is currently listed at $589,000, which would be a nice little commission for Mike. Now, the sellers still live in the house, but Mike schedules a viewing, and for some reason, instead of meeting at Mike and Mary Beth's office or even meeting at the property itself, Mike and this potential buyer, Steven, they agreed to meet up at this shopping mall parking lot that is not far from his home and office in Kirkland, Washington. Then together, the two of them go over to the house that he wants to see, which is located on a dead-end cul-de-sac, very secluded, very set back from the road, and it is a nice little bit of distance between this house and the neighboring home. The men tour the house. Steven is very interested, and after the fact, Mike drops him back off at the shopping mall parking lot that they'd met up at. Something about this man is very odd to Mike. It's something that he can't quite put his finger on, but it really doesn't matter to him because he is just here to facilitate a sale, and afterward, the two of them don't really ever have to speak again. He's not here to make a friend, baby. He is here on business. Later on that evening, once he gets home for the day, he and Mary Beth are talking about their day. He does tell her about this client, Steven, and how strange he was. He describes the man as being in his early 50s, as well as having an East Coast accent. And he also mentions to Mary Beth that the man has a nasty little limp and walks with a cane. Steven has recently relocated from Northern California and is currently staying with friends, so he's looking to close on his home really soon. He works as a counselor, and he is also expecting a very large payout from an inheritance which he plans on putting toward the cost of this house, which is why he is able to afford a $589,000 price tag. Mary Beth doesn't think much of it. It is not an unusual occurrence for them to talk about their day and share stories about their clients. It's also not uncommon for them to find their clients to be interesting characters worth a short chat. Now, the very next day, which was January 4th, it begins as any other day. The two of them start their day just as they do any other. Mike has his breakfast. He heads to the office. At the start of his morning, Mike mentions to a coworker of his that he has a follow-up appointment with a strange dude. And we know this strange dude to be Steven because he pencils in on his work planner, Steven, and 11:30 a.m. And again, he meets Steven in this shopping mall parking lot that is not far from the office instead of the property or the real estate office. Now, they drive together in Mike's Cadillac Escalade back to the property again while the current owners are away at work. But a little after noon, Gail Garland, the current owner of the home, heads home from her lunch break expecting the men to be gone by now. Now, when she gets home, the very first thing that she notices is that the front door has been left slightly ajar, and immediately she is annoyed. Now, when she enters her home, she hears the sound of running water coming from upstairs. And now she is a bit concerned. There are no cars outside, so she doesn't think that it's the realtor and his client. So at this point, she is like, did they leave my door open? And has someone now made their way inside? Like, what is going on? Gail creeps up the stairs to investigate, and a little more than halfway up the steps, she sees the start of a trail of blood that goes the rest of the way up the stairs and into her bathroom. And the bathroom, of course, is where the water is running out. Gail is a little bit better than me because I would have been in my car on the phone with 911 at the sound of water running, probably at that door. But this ain't me, this Gail's story, so I'm gonna tell it the way it happened. Gail proceeds slowly pushing open the door of her bathroom to find a very gruesome scene. Mike Emert, the realtor, is lying in the tub face down, and the water from the shower head is running down on him. He had been stabbed 19 times with a very long and sharp blade, like a sword of some sort. And the water at the sink is also still running. Of course, at this point, she goes and calls police, and it is obvious to investigators that he had been dragged there to the tub with the water left running on him to wash away any DNA that had been left behind by his attacker. And they believe that afterward, whoever had done this had gone to the sink to clean themselves and their weapon up, and had left the sink water running as well for the same purpose, to wash away any trace little bit of DNA that had been left in the sink. They believe it to be the Stephen person, and they feel like he chose this house because of how secluded it is. This person left behind no DNA whatsoever. This Stephen person, who they believe to be the person responsible, had also avoided coming to the office, of course, because he didn't want to be seen or recognizable. All that anyone knew was that he was meeting a person named Stephen. No one could tell how the man looked. No one knew a last name. No one had contact information. This was obviously a very well thought out and planned attack, and obviously not the work of a rookie. With how careful this Stephen person was, they believe this to be the work of a hired hitman. The limp, the cane, all in act. And this cane the man carried, they believe to have actually been his sword, disguised as a cane. It is unlikely, in their opinion, that a truly physically impaired older man could have overpowered Mike and managed to move his body into the tub after the fact. And apparently him leaving the water running had actually worked, because he did not leave behind a single trace of himself. The only DNA recovered from the scene is Mike's. They also realized that he had taken a few of Mike's possessions. His phone, his wallet, his wedding ring, and a very expensive watch are all missing from his body. But even with this, investigators don't believe this to have been a robbery. They believe that the person had simply taken these items to make it look that way. But who would hire somebody to take Mike out like this, and why? Word begins to spread throughout the real estate community about what had happened before officers even get a chance to reach out to Mary Beth themselves. Her mother, who was also a real estate agent in the area, hears through the grapevine that this has happened to Mike, and she reaches out to her daughter. Now, initially, Mary Beth is like, nobody called me, ain't nobody told me nothing, so maybe this is not true. Eventually, though, she does find out that she is wrong about that, unfortunately. And a couple of hours after Mike is discovered, his black Cadillac Escalade is found abandoned at the very same parking lot that he had met Stephen. They also check the car for DNA, and they are a little bit luckier than at the crime scene, because inside of his vehicle they find blood and skin samples that are not a match to Mike or any of his known associates. The DNA is submitted to the FBI database, and it does not come back as a match for anybody that they currently have in the database. So it just sits there in case there is a match in the future. A couple of hours after his vehicle is found, his wallet is found on top of a payphone in Seattle. His debit card is missing from the wallet, and they find that it had been used a couple of times after the appointment with Stephen. And sometime after that, his cell phone is recovered, which had also been used after the fact to make several outgoing calls. But the nature of these calls and the nature of the purchases made to his debit card have not been made public information, so I don't know where he went with the car girl or who he tried to call. None of the other stolen items, the watch or the wedding ring, have ever been recovered. Up until this point, investigators was looking at everybody with a side eye. Mary, Beth, all of his associates, they believed this to be a higher hit, and honey, they didn't know who the employer was. So everybody was under investigation. But once all of his associates, friends, and Mary Beth's DNA samples come back not being a match to the DNA found inside of the vehicle, they are all cleared as potential suspects. And that's as far as having done this themselves. They interview a lot of his associates, his friends, his wife, and they cannot find anyone that they believe would have motive to do this to Mike. They appeal to the public with a $5,000 reward for any viable information. Yet no one comes forward with anything. And in the area of the shopping center, there is a very well-known unhoused man that loiters in that parking lot that also fits the physical description Mike had given Mary Beth of this Steven character. He is a man in his 50s or 60s. He walks with a cane. He has a limp. And so he is looked at as a potential suspect. They go and pick up this man. His name is Jeffrey. And they speak with him. And he tells them, just like Ezell said on Friday, look, I don't kill, okay? He denies any involvement whatsoever. And when they take a look at his criminal history, it matches up with what he said. No violent crimes in his past. Just a little theft, little fraud. He also is very cooperative with police. He takes a polygraph test, which he passes. He submits a DNA sample, both blood and hair samples, and neither of them match what they have from the crime scene. So he is then cleared as a person of interest. At this point, they question whether or not the person really responsible had decided to meet Mike at this parking lot with this cane and this fake limp to frame Jeffrey and make it seem like Jeffrey is the person. Investigators conduct hundreds of interviews and they spend countless hours talking to these people. They go back as far as 10 years interviewing people who had some sort of contact with Mike to try to find anybody who they think could potentially benefit from Mike's death, and they find nothing. The only thing that they are sure of when it comes to their suspect is that this is not their first rodeo. Outside of the very small amount of DNA that they had found inside of the Escalade, Steven had done a great job covering his tracks. The loss of Mike is felt immensely, not only by his wife Mary Beth, but his colleagues as well. He was very well known and very well liked in the real estate community. His case was highlighted on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. Unfortunately, it aired the day after 9/11, so people were kind of distracted. But together, the real estate agents who were familiar with him and fond of him raised an additional $50,000 to go on top of the $5,000 as reward money to help solve the case, but still nothing. At this point, the Washington State Real Estate Safety Council is established to help protect real estate agents in the area from experiencing anything similar to this. But contacting Mike directly, only on his cell phone, never at the office, meeting only at a third location, these are all red flags. It is also later determined that all of the calls he had made to Mike's cell phone had come from a payphone. So him leaving that wallet on top of the payphone was kind of like taunting them. At this point, it becomes a requirement for real estate agents to only meet their clients at the office first, and it is required that the client provide their license. A decade passes without any breaks in the case. Then in September of 2011, Mary Beth, Mike's widow, receives the call that she has been waiting on for 10 years and 9 months. Finally, after all of this time, they have a rock solid DNA match for her husband's killer. But we'll come back to that. In the year before Mary Beth gets that call, on March 26th of 2010, at around 10:30 p.m., Dr. Craig McAllister is returning home with his 20-year-old son Ryan in the Kirkland area of Washington, very near the shopping mall parking lot. Now, Ryan is home from college, spring break. His father had just picked him up from the airport. They park their vehicle along the street in front of their house, and as the two of them are making their way up toward the door, they are ambushed by a man dressed in all black and wearing a ski mask. The man very calmly tells the father and son that he is armed, and if they cooperate, no one will be hurt. He then tells them that he wants inside of this house. But see, Dr. Craig is not about to let that happen, because inside of his house is his wife Stacy and their 13-year-old daughter Lauren. So instead, he jumps onto the masked man and the two of them begin to tussle. And while they tussling and carrying on, Ryan goes and bolts towards the neighbor's house so he can call for help. Unfortunately though, a second masked man emerges from the darkness, jumps on Craig, pistol whips him, causing a big gash behind his left ear, leaving him completely disoriented. Now with Craig down on the ground, the two masked men proceed to try to kick in the front door, and the kick on the door grabs the attention of the wife Stacy. She walks right up to the door and opens it. The only thing that she had heard was something hit the door. She was expecting her husband and son to be home any minute, so she didn't think anything of it when she heard someone at the door. She thought it was them. Once she sees that it is two masked men standing there, she immediately closes it and gets the deadbolt on before they can barge in. And at this point, she dials 911. And by now, Ryan has also dialed 911 from the neighbor's house. The men go back to Craig, who is still down. They demand that he let them inside of the house. And again, he refuses. With Craig refusing still, the two men go and have a little side chat. At this point, they are visibly frustrated. They're flustered, all of the things, okay? They know that their window of opportunity to get this done and escape is narrowing, but they are still unwilling to leave with nothing. They demand that the doctor give them his car keys, and for a second he contemplates giving in and just tossing them the keys, but then he realizes that his door key is on his house key ring. So at the very last minute, he lies to them and says that his son has the car keys and the son is long gone. They again convene over to the side for a few moments, and then they tell the doctor that they're leaving, but they want him to stay on the ground until they're gone. Now he does just that. He lays there, he watches them take off on foot, and afterward he stands and goes inside the house and waits for the police to arrive. And by the time police get their child, these men are long gone, okay? They bring in the K9 squad to attempt to trace down the scent to let them know which direction the men went in. It leads them to nothing, but they do have a little something to go on, because during the tussle, the doctor had ripped off one of the men's ski masks and it was still laying in the driveway with DNA. And this DNA that belongs to John Bradshaw will crack open the decade-old murder case of real estate agent Mike Emert. Now, before I tell you how, I need to introduce you to this guy, Gary Krueger, and I promise you it's about to all tie in together and make sense. Just stick with me. Now, Gary here had enlisted in the U.S. Navy right after high school. He served in the Vietnam War. He'd also switched over to the Marines after his little bout in the Navy. While in the Marines, he becomes a part of the Combined Actions Group, which was a very elite experimental group within the branch. And by several accounts, Gary was a pretty cool guy until he had joined the military. During his time in Vietnam, Gary begins to change, and not for the better. He is becoming very aggressive, short-tempered, and just downright mean. 2 years into his enlistment, he is honorably discharged and is sent back to Seattle, baby, where he had grown up. There he joins both the police academy and the Army Reserves, and not long afterward, mid-70s, he meets and marries his wife Betty, and the two of them have a daughter. But it is not long before that honeymoon phase begins to fade, and Gary begins to show the nasty true nature of his personality, which then steers their whole dynamic in a very tumultuous direction. And he ain't just toxic at home. Over the years, his reputation as a police officer becomes worse and worse. He is very known for his vile disposition. He is known to be a hothead, and Gary has several alarming run-ins with civilians on the job. In one instance, he responds to this call from a hospital where there was a patient, a veteran like himself, who they report as being very unruly and disruptive, harassing the nurses and all of the patients. Gary gets there, uses this wrestling taking hold on the man, who dies as a result, and Gary faces no repercussions for this. Around this time, Betty had become fed up with Gary's attitude and his personality, and she decides to separate and ultimately divorce him. 4 years after this incident with the veteran in the hospital, Gary and another officer respond to a call that results in an arrest of a man who they viciously beat inside of the police parking garage while they have him handcuffed. Now for this, Gary and the other officer received, I'm not sure what the punishment was. It was only described as a slap on the wrist. And the man who was beaten, he filed a civil suit and won $3,000. 3 years later, Gary responds to a call about a prowler named Roger Lee Stanley, and he, from his patrol car, fatally shoots the man 4 times. Gary is charged and tried in court for this, but he claims that he had done so in self-defense because the man had threatened that he had a weapon and was prepared to take him out. With this, the jury decides that this was a justified action and Gary is acquitted. Just 2 years after this, Gary, along with other officers, respond to a call about a man who was out here high on PCP and disrupting the peace. The man does go for Gary's weapon, and in response, Gary flies into a blind rage and begins beating the man so badly that the other officers have to step in and pull him off the guy. The man was not fighting him back, and Gary had nearly beaten him to death. Now at this point, somebody begins to question whether or not there's something wrong with little Gary. He is referred to a psychiatrist and court ordered to attend sessions. His weapons are also taken from him as, a little precaution. His anger issues by now have become his entire identity, both at home and professionally. Even his friends begin to distance themselves from him, colleagues as well. Now, the doctor he sees refers to him as a liability in a professionally written letter regarding their sessions that also says, quote, Officer Krueger is becoming increasingly unable to control his temper and is becoming physically abusive to suspects and exercising excessive force. Once his sessions wrap up, and that is the doctor's findings, child, Gary officially announces his retirement from the Seattle Police Department. And in his resignation letter, he cites a back injury obtained during a on-foot chase as his reason for retiring. But everybody knew that he was not given the choice. It was either at that point retire or be fired. And of course, Gary had decided to save face. Not only is he forced to retire, he is also forced to withdraw from the Army Reserve, so he don't have that either. And at this point, Gary is just entering his 30s. With 2 failed careers, a failed marriage, he is now unemployed, lost, and angrier than ever. At this point, he decides to pursue a career in real estate. He makes a few lucrative moves on the real estate scene and gets a property of his own, but it's not something that he really excels at. And he very quickly becomes frustrated with his inability to succeed in the field. It is a very short-lived career. He gives up and at that point decides to go try to gamble and flip the little money that he does have. By 1982, 2 years after failing at his real estate career, he has developed a nasty little gambling addiction. He is still very much unemployed and in financial ruin, so much so that he decides to go ahead and file bankruptcy. He also goes back for Betty and tries to rekindle their broken relationship, and somehow Gary manages to come up on lump sums of money some way and somehow, and he uses this money to woo Betty. He tries his best to take their little co-parenting situation back into a family situation. Gary wanted his family back, and with the little money that he would come up on, he would use to take them on domestic family vacations and really just spoil his wife and daughter. And eventually Betty does come back around. In 1984, the two of them remarried. Gary wanted that old thing back and he got it. He continues to get these bouts of money from somewhere, but the source of his funds is brought to light roughly 2 years later in October of 1986 when an officer attempts to pull him over for speeding in this stolen Chrysler. Now, when Gary sees the blue lights, he does not stop and pull over, okay? He hits the accelerator and takes the officer on a high-speed chase that ends with a crash. Inside of the vehicle, Gary is wearing a trench coat. I don't know if he had clothes on underneath, but he had a trench coat on. And he also had 2 duffel bags with ski masks, rubber masks, a police scanner, and several firearms. They find out that Gary has been out here robbing banks, and he was not working alone. He has a partner in crime called Carl Keller, and Carl, when they round up Carl, he admits to everything, sings like a canary in exchange for a lesser charge, whereas Gary receives 2 federal felony armed robbery charges. He pleads guilty to them, and for this receives a 15-year prison sentence. In 1992, he is released early for being a good boy after only serving a third of his sentence. And Betty had held him down from the inside. That was her man, and she was going to stick beside him. 7 years after this sentence, the now 51-year-old Gary racks up a misdemeanor 3rd-degree theft charge in Kirkland, Washington. And for this, he doesn't receive any jail time. And a month after the murder of real estate agent Mike Emert, Gary robs another bank and makes it away with $3,130 cash. Now, the problem is, I guess Gary saw that as I guess it was successful. He decides to circle back and rob that same bank again just 2 months after that. And this time, Gary was not so lucky. Using a pellet gun, he sticks up the teller and he gets $6,500 in his little hands this time, but he doesn't make it away. He is apprehended and hit with 2 more robbery charges. He is sentenced to 5 years, 8 months for these acts. And again, Betty holds down her man. Now, because Gary had been diagnosed previously with PTSD and has served time in the military, the judge kind of felt for him, gave him some encouraging words, told him to get his life together because it's not too late. He is still young enough to do so, but child, Gary is gonna do Gary, okay? He goes in to do his little prison bid, and again, Gary is released early for good behavior after serving just under 3 years. Part of the agreement of his early release is that he submit a DNA sample to the FBI to go in their database, which he of course agrees to do, but he manages to duck the FBI for 3 more years without submitting that DNA sample. His sample is not collected until 2007. And even now that he has submitted the DNA sample in 2007, the sample sits for years without being processed into the database. Apparently at this time they had an extensive backlog of forensic testing, and so they couldn't get around to it. Gary's DNA sample is not processed until 2011. And by then, they were a little too late. Now, going back to the ski mask found in Dr. Craig's driveway in 2010, the forensic examination of the ski mask yields 2 different people's DNA. But when they are put into the DNA database, only one comes back as a hit. A man named John Allen Bradshaw. John is a 65-year-old man who ain't got no business out here trying to rob somebody in a ski mask, but here he was. And although he had an extensive criminal history, there were no violent crimes or home invasions, just a little arson and a little bit of money laundering. And the address that they find listed for John is a property that is owned by Gary Krueger. And looking at Gary's history, they're almost certain that these are the 2 men that had ambushed the doctor and his son. But when they go find John to talk to him, they can't find him anywhere, and neither can they find this landlord of his, Gary Krueger. And during their investigation, they find that only a week after the doctor and his son were ambushed, Betty, Gary's wife, had filed a missing persons report for him. And in it, she stated that her husband was broke and desperate for money and that she had not seen him since March 26th, the day that the doctor was ambushed. 6 months go by and they're still out here looking for Gary and John. No one has seen or heard from Gary at all. 6 months go by before they locate him. Gary's body is found floating in Lake Washington. And while searching the area where his body was found, they also find a capsized boat that had sank and was actually stolen from a neighbor of the doctor the night of the ambush. They also find a duffel bag with hand restraints, duct tape, weapons, and plenty of ammunition. It is obvious at that point that although it was very risky of him to do, the the doctor had made the right choice refusing to let them in, because this was not going to be a simple robbery. What they found in their bag alludes to a much more violent potential outcome. They informed Betty that they had found her husband's remains, and it was determined that he had drowned. The very next day after he was discovered, Betty files for bankruptcy. She said, baby, if he not gonna fix this financial situation, I guess I have to do it. Now brace yourself, because I told y'all this is about to tie in. They also discovered that this attack on Dr. Craig McAllister was not a random attack at all. It was very personal. Dr. Craig McAllister had very recently refused to perform a knee surgery free of charge on Betty, Gary's wife. So instead of him going to figure out a payment plan, saving up his coins, trying to finance or fundraise, selling waters on a warm day or cookies in front of the grocery store or chocolate bars in the parking lot like these other hustlers, he had decided to break into the McAllister home and do God knows what to his family. The way he had failed at the mission, stolen a neighbor's boat, and subsequently drowned is like a form of poetic justice. Now, remember the DNA sample that Gary had to submit, right? In 2011, a whole year after he was found floating in the lake, his DNA is finally processed. And not only does it come back as a match for the second person's DNA found on the ski mask, confirming what they already knew, that he and John were partners, but it also comes back as a match for the DNA found inside of Mike Emert's Cadillac Escalade, the only DNA that they could not match to anybody. So Mike's wife gets the call that they finally got a DNA match, which enabled them to identify her husband's killer. She unfortunately also gets the news that at this point, the killer has been dead for a year and a half. And she is livid, because had it been collected upon his parole like it was supposed to be in 2004, he would have been identified then. Even if it had been processed when they finally did get it in 2007, they would have been able to identify him, possibly detain him, but no, it had sat on the desk waiting to be processed for 5 more years, leaving this man free out here to run amok. One good thing that does come up once he is identified is the fact that a lot of people, because investigators were so sure with how clean the crime scene was and how well the person had covered their tracks, that this was a professional hit, a lot of people believed and assumed that Mary Beth had hired someone to take her husband out and had gotten away with it. But after finding out Gary's background with the military and police department, it all made sense. And they believe the why is just for whatever little money he could score. Although it is a working theory that Gary had targeted Mike because he was jealous of him and how successful he was in the real estate game. Granted, after an extensive amount of digging, investigators failed to prove that Gary and Mike had a personal relationship before the ambush for him to even have a personal vendetta against Mike. They still believe that it's possible that this was a hired hit and Gary was hired by somebody else. So it was either that or a robbery, for sure. As for his partner, John Allen Bradshaw, his whereabouts still remain a mystery till this day. He was never seen or heard from again, and they searched the lake where Gary had been found and they were unable to find him, which did not leave the McAllisters feeling all that secure. They felt like if he was still out there, it was a possibility that he might come back and try to, finish what he had started. And since Gary's death, he has been linked to an additional 3 unsolved homicides that detectives strongly believe that he is responsible for. The first occurred in 1981, where former police officer Terry Dolan was shot outside of a gas station that he owned and managed over in Everett, Washington. Initially, it had appeared to only be a robbery, but was later determined to be a staged and planned attack. Gary was 33 at the time, a struggling real estate agent at the time, and he was named a person of interest at the time as well, but with a lack of physical evidence, he was never able to be charged or detained. 3 years after that, in 1984, attorney Jim Barry was staying late at his office. He had told his colleagues that he had some more work that he needed to get done and that he had a late night appointment with a client. Sometime during the evening, he was ambushed and stabbed repeatedly by an unidentified person and left to bleed out in his office. At the time, Jim was representing a bank that was going after Gary for a very large loan that Gary was delinquent on. Again, Gary was a person of interest. However, there was not enough physical evidence left behind to tie him to the scene. And just a year after that, a Seattle union boss, Mario, I believe the last name is pronounced Vaccarino, he was the head of the Hotel and Restaurants Employees Union, and he was found in a bathtub just like Mike. Mario had been viciously beaten and then drugged to the bathtub. And at this time, Gary was 37 years old and in his violent prime. Also, Parmesan cheese had been sprinkled all over Mario's body. And again, Gary had been named as a person of interest after it was discovered that a very close friend of Gary's, who he served in the Vietnam War with, worked underneath Mario and was afraid that he was about to be fired. And after Mario's death, Joe's job was no longer in jeopardy. In fact, he got his boss's job and went on to surpass Mario's title, becoming the union president. Now, after Gary's death, when they're trying to connect all these dots and they're piecing all of the things together, they go to Betty, his wife, and straight up ask her. They're like, look, he is gone. We cannot punish him. We know you a ride or die, but he out of here, girl. He can't suffer no kind of consequence. Just be honest with us. I'm of course paraphrasing, but they do let her know, like, he's gone. We can't do anything. But what do you think? Like, do you think he's done this? And she says, quote, of course he did. Like, girl. Now, with the way the law works, it's a little too late for them to prosecute or even just close out the case and pencil him in as the perpetrator. And so Gary was a wild boy out here getting away with everything. A menace to society, a thug. And I want to know your thoughts. So please leave them down below. Make sure you like the video before you leave. Subscribe if you have not. As always, I appreciate you so much for spending your time with me, especially however much time this video took. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Peace. What is up? My chair don't start because I am not that heavy. Why am I that thirsty? When she enters the home, she hears the running of sound water. The running of water. I could have played that out. With the shower head running water. Okay, what? And they believe the cane to actually have been like, okay, in that parking lot. That also mitts. I be getting concealer in my hair. Y'all don't be saying nothing. Y'all just let me keep going, keep talking. And for the client to provide their license, not license plate, girl. And while they tussling, Ryan runs to I can't talk. Why can't I talk, baby? Now, unfortunately, shout out to Dr. Craig. It's giving courageous. I don't know my daddy like that, but I doubt he would have been that fearless. Is this camera on me? I don't even know how I want my makeup to look, girl. I'm just winging it. Oh, that blue look cute. Let's go with it. The purple is the one. The purple is the one for show. It's giving regalities. But first, I need to introduce. But before I tell you how, I need to introduce you to this guy. Now, that's me. But before I tell you how, I need to introduce you to this guy. That's still me. My goodness. What are we talking about? Y'all ever had the ice cream truck come through your neighborhood after dark? Like, is that not creepy? The sound of an ice cream truck brings me joy in the daytime, but baby, after the sun go down, it got me looking over my shoulder. Now, Gary here had enlisted in the U.S. Navy right out. I thought he was in the Army. Maybe I thought wrong. Now, Gary here had enlisted in the Army Reserves. That's why I thought he was in the Army. He was. I was right. And shortly after, which we're okay, and has several very troubling. And a month after the murder of Mark, his name was not Mark, baby. And a month after the murder of real estate agent Mark, what did I just say? Now, going back to the ski mask found in Dr. Greg's, that ain't his name. John Allen Baldwin. That is not his name. What is with, it's too many people in the story, girl. I can't keep up. and he was named a person of I was gonna say injury,